Hi, folks. Today we are going to talk about the topic of nicotine. Go to our PowerPoint slides here. All right. So nicotine, we would definitely categorize as a stimulant, although we do have a separate chapter for stimulants in general, which is actually going to be the next lecture that I record and post for you guys. So although nicotine is categorized as a stimulant, technically speaking, it's getting its own chapter here in your textbook. And of course, as you guys are aware, uh, nicotine, traditionally speaking, is consumed via tobacco, although these days smoking has become less and less popular as vaping has kind of become more in vogue. And we're only beginning to have an idea of the health effects of vaping. It just hasn't been around that long, so there's really not a lot that we can say about it yet at this point because vaping just has not been around as long as smoking has. But we have years and years of data now on the health effects of smoking that we can talk about, but vaping is just so new. Tobacco use in Europe and the Far East is associated with many notable names. The first European to be exposed to tobacco was Christopher Columbus, shortly after he discovered the New World on October 12th, 1492. He was given leaves of tobacco as a gift. Later, his men discovered that the Indians were, quote, drinking smoke. One sailor in particular, Rodrigo de Juarez, became the first documented European smoker. He took the habit back with him to Spain, but was quickly denounced as being possessed by the devil, since only the devil could emit smoke from their nose and mouth without being on fire. He was turned over to the Inquisition and imprisoned for witchcraft. Early on, nicotine was used as medicine for everything from headaches to colds. It was called a holy plant. In 1559, Jean Nicot, the French ambassador to Portugal, gave tobacco plants to Catherine de' Medici, the Queen of France, as a treatment for migraines. However, in 1604, King James I of England condemned tobacco as, quote, a stinking weed and characterized smoking as a, quote, custom loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, harmful to the brain, and dangerous to the lung. He also noted that tobacco caused dependency. In 17th century Russia, officials established penalties for smoking that ranged from whipping, exile, and even death. These prohibitions were repeated in China, Turkey, and Japan. A sultan of Turkey, though, eventually took up the smoking habit in 1648, and shortly thereafter, the penalties for tobacco use evaporated. Tsar Peter the Great regarded smoking as a symbol of modernism in 1689, and it wasn't long before other countries gave up trying to enforce penalties. Even King James I eventually embraced the habit when he realized the kind of revenue that could be made from taxing the plant. One form of tobacco use was called snuff, a quantity of finely shredded or powdered tobacco. They would sniff it up the nose and then exhale it with a sneeze. By the 1700s, this custom overtook smoking as the dominant European form of tobacco use. It was called snuffing, the ingestion of snuff either by inhalation or by absorption through tissue in the nose. Snuffing brought about some degree of relief from a world that at the time did not smell good, literally. In 1777, when Benjamin Franklin was sent to gain support against the British from the French, the American tobacco market was open to the French in exchange for money. Had it not been for American tobacco, there might not have been a United States of America at all. Snuffing in the United States was replaced by chewing. It was a low-cost way to enjoy the addiction while leaving the hands free for work, but spitting became a matter of public health. Targeting a spittoon was more difficult than it looked. Around the time of the Civil War, two new trends emerged. The first was cigars, tightly rolled quantities of dried tobacco leaves. Cultivation and curing tobacco leaves had improved, making the tobacco more easily smoked and more palatable. Stogies were foot-long cigars named for Conestoga wagons they were used on by settlers heading west. The second trend was cigarettes, rolls of shredded tobacco wrapped in paper, today usually fitted at the mouth end with a filter. These started with popularity among British soldiers returning from the Crimean War in 1856. The cigar industry was opposed to cigarette use in the United States, but the invention of a cigarette rolling machine that could turn out 120,000 cigarettes a day started changing things. By the end of the 1800s, cigarettes were as cheap as 20 for a nickel. In the early 20th century, there were two major influences on changing from cigars to cigarettes: women and war. The suffragette movement had begun, and women wanted the right to vote and the right to smoke. Cigarettes were much more popular among women than cigars were. When men went off to war in World War I, cigarettes became an alternative to taking tobacco to the battlefield. Uh, yeah, cigarettes rather made a better alternative for soldiers trying to take tobacco to the battlefield. By 1963, the per capita consumption of cigarettes was approximately 4,300 cigarettes per year, or 12 per day for every man, woman, and child living in the United States. In the 1980s, approximately 9 billion cigarettes were sold each year. The decrease in consumption started in 1964 and the release of the Surgeon General's report linking tobacco, smoking, and other serious diseases serious diseases such as cancer. In 1971, all television advertising of cigarettes was banned. In 1984, the year I was born, all tobacco products were required to carry a warning label. By the 1990s, about 95% of all smokers chose to smoke filtered cigarettes. Unfortunately, this also meant that tobacco companies changed the formulation of tobacco as a stronger blend with a higher tar content. In 2007, it was confirmed that the nicotine concentration in cigarettes had increased by 11% by cigarette manufacturers. Clear relationships between education level and smoking were established. The higher the education level, the less likely a person was to smoke. Daily smoking increases steadily with age. People 25 to 44 are the most likely to smoke today. It is higher among adults living below the poverty level at 29% than those who do not at 16%. Again, nicotine use, particularly smoking, is associated with poverty. Nicotine is clearly an addictive drug. It's also associated with being less educated. The earlier you start, the higher your risk of becoming addicted. Again, the younger you start using, the higher your risk of becoming addicted forever. And maybe this is the reason why I was able to kick the habit, because I actually didn't start smoking until I was actually in my early to mid 20s, which is kind of unusual. And I had quit by the time I was in my early 30s. And maybe that had something to do with it, because I had started at an older age, perhaps. Uh, so again, smoking's higher among adults living in poverty and higher among adults with lower education levels. The amount of nicotine in a typical cigarette is enough to kill a child or make an adult very sick. But smoking tobacco or inhaling nicotine is absorbed rapidly into the blood through the lungs and within seconds to the brain. If taken by mouth in the form of snuff or chewing tobacco, the absorption may be more complete, but the dose is delivered over a longer period of time. Both result in the same peak concentration of nicotine in the blood over time. Nicotine gum delivers less nicotine than snuff. Cigars may be smoked but are often chewed and give the same results as dipping snuff or chewing tobacco. Smoking results in peak concentrations in about 10 minutes, but declines rapidly. 20 minutes after smoking, the nicotine concentration in your levels have been divided in half. So it has a very short half-life in your blood. This is part of why people chain smoke. Cigarettes allow a smoker control over the peaks and valleys of exposure, as does vaping, and is very effective at delivering the drug. But it also sets the smoker up for addiction. The rapid route to the brain provides a quick hit, and the rapid redistribution out of the brain means the body is ready for another hit pretty quickly after you're done with the cigarette. The liver metabolizes nicotine pretty quickly with cotinine, and nicotine in oxide is excreted by the kidneys as part of that process. But cotinine is the marker that is used in urine screens for nicotine, which they are doing these days, by the way. More and more companies are urine testing employees for nicotine use. And there are a fair number of companies now that actually will not hire people that use nicotine because of the health risks and the costs on the employee health insurance. So I've heard, for example, like the Escambia County School District, Baptist Healthcare, just to name a couple of local examples of employers here from the Pensacola area who are now nicotine testing, from what I've been told. So nicotine is a drug that causes physical dependence and addiction. To just put that mildly, that's an understatement. Um, so, we have basically three lines of evidence, right? From a behavioral perspective, nicotine provides what's called reinforcement, very strong positive reinforcement, which is associated with significant dopamine release in the brain. Anytime you see positive reinforcement, the more positive reinforcement there is, the more dopamine release, and certainly nicotine use heavily activates that dopamine pathway in the brain that is associated with positive reinforcement. We also see tolerance and withdrawal with nicotine use that develops pretty rapidly, actually. So I remember the first time that I used nicotine, it almost like made me feel kind of buzzed, like it was like kind of a feeling of lightheadedness. I don't know about other people who tried nicotine for the first time, but when I used it, I mean, you felt it. I mean, it hit you like hard. But then pretty quickly after I had become a regular nicotine user, I no longer got that rush from consuming nicotine that I got when I first started. After about a month of being a user, or even more quickly, it just got to the point where you were just smoking or consuming to feel normal, and it didn't give you much of a rush or a buzz anymore. And that's how it gets. When you become a regular smoker, you're not doing it for a buzz, you're just doing it to feel normal at that point, to get rid of the feelings of withdrawal. A lot of people, when they try nicotine for the first time, they'll actually get such a strong hit from it that it'll make you nauseous. And some people will throw up the first time they use nicotine. So again, people use nicotine because it calms them down and alleviates feelings of withdrawal, even though paradoxically speaking, technically speaking, its effects on the central nervous system are as a stimulant. In addition to causing a lot of dopamine release in the brain, nicotine also causes significant levels of acetylcholine release. And this is the reason why, for example, nicotine use has been associated with concentration and memory improvement in some folks, because acetylcholine actually is the neurotransmitter in your brain that is critical for memory and attention. It's one of the neurotransmitters, at least, that's critical for memory and attention. And in fact, it's the neurotransmitter that gets wiped out by Alzheimer's disease, right? But using nicotine does cause a temporary bump of acetylcholine levels in the brain. So this is the reason why some people will experience temporarily, at least, alterations to their memory and concentration. Not only will often people gain weight when they quit smoking because of the stimulant effects of nicotine, but people will often report temporarily cognitive disruptions because your brain has gotten so used to being on nicotine all the time. When you go through that withdrawal, your brain has to go through this recalibration of your acetylcholine levels, so it can make you feel a bit mentally off in a number of different ways when you're quitting. Uh, Interestingly enough, like I said, smokers are most likely to start when they're young, during adolescence or young adulthood for most people. And interestingly enough, there is a connection between nicotine use and major depressive disorder, right? And adolescents who are diagnosed with major depressive disorder are much more statistically likely to develop a nicotine habit, among other addictions as well. Depression is actually correlated with a number of different addictions, including alcoholism and nicotine use, but particularly among adolescents. So in terms of some terminology regarding exposing others to cigarette smoke, sometimes you'll hear these terms used interchangeably, but they technically have different meanings. So secondhand smoke is the smoke that's exhaled out of the mouth of a smoker. Side stream smoke is the smoke coming off the cigarette that doesn't get inhaled, that's unfiltered. So side stream smoke, actually, arguably speaking, is the most damaging to people who are around you because it doesn't go through your lungs and it doesn't go through the filter, right? So side stream smoke is unfiltered smoke coming off of a lit cigarette, cigar, or pipe that is inhaled by people around the smoker. Third-hand smoke is when it gets into the seats, like if you ever ride in the car of someone who smokes in their car, you can smell it in the upholstery of the vehicle. Or if you enter the home of someone who smokes inside their home, God forbid. I cannot understand for the life of me why someone would smoke inside their home. It's just a great way to ruin just the way your home smells. It's a great way to ruin your home in general. But that's third-hand smoke. If you walk into the home or a car of someone who regularly smokes in there and you smell the residue on the seating and on the furniture, then and the carcinogens actually can be, like left in the fabric, and that can actually affect people's health, believe it or not. So all of these forms of exposure to cigarette smoke can be harmful, not only to the smoker, but to those in the environment of the smoker. So nicotine does cross the placental barrier into the mother's blood, and it is considered a pretty significant teratogen of developing children. As we've talked about before, a teratogen is any substance that could cause damage to a developing child or fetus or embryo, and nicotine is certainly among those. Everybody pretty much knows at this point that you're not supposed to smoke when you're pregnant. If you do, you're putting the health of your child at risk, no doubt about it, right? In multiple ways, low birth weight, carbon monoxide exposure can cause issues with the development of the nervous system. Children who are exposed to nicotine during pregnancy are statistically more likely to die of sudden infant death syndrome after they're born. And also infants who are exposed to cigarette smoke in their environment are much more likely to die of SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome. It's one of the leading causes of sudden infant death, actually, is smoke in the environment. So cigarette smoke is bad news, both for a pregnant mother and for infants in the environment who have already been born. It's just all bad news. Stay away from cigarette smoke while you're pregnant and keep cigarette smoke away from your children. It's just bad news for fetuses and children in general. Not to mention the example that you're setting for your children, and children of smokers are much more statistically likely to become smokers themselves. Of course, there are different forms of nicotine that can be consumed other than smoking, like smokeless tobacco. And of course, this is not without its health risks. Smokeless forms of tobacco like snuff and dipping, of course, dramatically increase the likelihood of esophageal cancers, cancers of the mouth, lesions in the mouth, gum disease, really bad for your teeth, to put it mildly. Really, really bad for your dental health to use smokeless tobacco. I cannot overstate that. So under new Florida law, as of a few years ago, and I think this is federally now too, I think you have to be 21 now all over the country to buy tobacco. I know at least in Florida. For years, it was actually 18. Back when I was a kid, it was 18, and I was a nicotine user back then. So I remember I was so excited for my 18th birthday so I could go buy my first legal pack of cigarettes. It was like this big deal. I'll never forget it. I bought my first legal pack of cigarettes at the Raceway gas station on Highway 29, which is near the intersection of 29 and Burgess Road. That gas station is still there, actually. It was a pack of Marlboro Reds. So, my first legal pack of cigarettes. I won't say it was my first pack of cigarettes, but first legal pack of cigarettes. And I'm very thankful that I was able to kick that habit years ago, like I said. And, these days it's more likely to be vaping that you're going to see more and more people get into. Of course, smoking still exists, but its popularity has been on the decline. But again, these days it's 21 to purchase tobacco products or nicotine products in the state of Florida, and I believe in other states now as well. And here in this slide, you can see the various legal penalties associated with the illegal sale and possession of nicotine among minors. Bottom line here is don't start using nicotine. It's such a cliche, but the easiest way to quit nicotine is to never start because it truly is a highly addictive substance. Arguably speaking, you could make an argument that nicotine is maybe the most addictive of all the substances that we talk about in this class. And if this were a live class meeting at this point, I would have a video that I would be playing for you guys on the issue of vaping. The name of the documentary that I would recommend on this topic is called Nick Sick, The Dangers of Youth Vaping from PBS. And like I said, if we hadn't had our technological issue in class that caused me to have to record this lecture, then that's the documentary that we would be watching during the class meeting, a PBS documentary entitled Nick Sick, The Dangers of Youth Vaping. And I highly recommend that you go online and find that documentary. If you just go into Google and type Nick Sick, The Dangers of Youth Vaping, it should come right up. There's a lot of recent information about the latest research on vaping. So again, I recommend that documentary. And at this point, this is going to bring my recorded lecture on the topic of nicotine to a close. And the next one that I'm going to record when I get the chance will be on the related topic of stimulants. So stay tuned for the release of the recorded lecture on stimulants. And thanks for taking the time to watch this recorded lecture on nicotine. I hope that you found it helpful.